Hi, Assalamualaikum and greetings to all. This is not our video lecture slide series, rather this is our revision video. So I'm using the Padlet revision board, and hopefully all these critical concepts will be able to make sense to you. Whatever that we have learned for the past 14 weeks, they are all here on this revision board, and hopefully this can be one of the tools that can help you to understand better whatever, as I said, that we have learned for the past 14 weeks, inshallah. So let us begin, ladies and gentlemen. This is LLS3364, language diversity, variation, choice and change. So let us first take a look at this language variation, because according to the title that we have here, we're going to look at variation first, and then choice and change, and the rest will come into their proper places. So language variation, what does it mean by language variation? Language variation, ways of saying the same thing. So under these language variations, we are looking at dialects, standard language, non-standard language, context. So that's the key critical concepts under language variation. Now don't worry too much about this, ladies and gentlemen. This video comes with the PDF notes of all this. So my advice is, when you listen to this, you also look at the notes. They are similar notes, but perhaps here is a little bit smaller for you to really focus on, so you can actually look at the PDF notes attached to this video. So dialects, when we talk about dialects, they are features of pronunciation, vocabulary and grammar that change across regions. There are 5 types of dialects. We have regional dialect, we have social dialect, we have vernacular dialect, we have ethnic dialect, and last but not least, we have dialect continuum. Now remember, dialect continuum is the fact that 2 dialects which are close to one another, they will always be able to be understood by speakers of these 2 dialects. For example, people who live in Terengganu and people who live in Kelantan, they will be able to understand both dialects simply because they are very close to one another. So that's the meaning of dialect continuum. So for regional means it depends on the geographical location. Social means it depends on your social class. Vernacular is very specific to one particular place, and then where you have different people talking different languages with different dialect. Ethnic always refers to a same thing, similar place, but this is like across the areas. So ethnic. So if you talk about, for example, I would say the most challenging under dialect types would be vernacular and ethnic. So you really have to go back and have a look at the definition. But if, let's say, you find that they are rather confusing, look at the definition. Vernacular is basically the I would say in Bahasa Melayu, like Bahasa Pasar kind of dialect, and ethnic is depending on the tribal groups or the people, the races, but not so much as the races, the big one, but ethnic more of a smaller version of it. So I hope that makes sense. And then we look at registers. What's the meaning of registers? They are variations in style, tone and vocabulary adapted to specific social contexts or audiences, and for specific purposes, ranging from highly formal to very casual. There are again 5 types of registers. We have intimate register, we have casual register, we have formal register, we have static, or also known as frozen register, and then we have consultative register. So intimate is normally between people who are very close, husband and wife, siblings, for example. And casual is normally used between friends. And for formal occasions between you and your lecturer. And in terms of static and frozen, that means that particular register will not change normally. For example, khutbah Jumaat or sermon in churches. And then we have consultative. This is something like a doctor and a patient, where there's authority for the doctor to say something like, you have to follow my advice. So something like that. Now, going on to standard versus non-standard language. So what does it mean by a standard language? It is a highly codified, prestigious variety of a language used in public discourse, education, and government. And on the other hand, if you talk about non-standard language, they are variations in grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation that differ from the standard language, from the established socially preferred standard variety of a language. So in order to talk about standard versus non-standard language, you must be able to talk about the characteristics. So just focus on characteristics of a standard language. The main characteristics include: a standard language has its own dictionary. A standard language is normally used in the broadcast, for example, in the newspaper or in the media, for example, official media. And it is normally used in official and governmental settings. So the opposite of these characteristics would be the characteristics of the non-standard language. For example, a non-standard language does not have a dictionary. So just remember the characteristics, the main characteristics of a standard language, then you'll be fine to talk about non-standard language. Moving on to the last aspect under language variation would be context. Now, in all languages, there will be what we call as context. Basically, contexts are the surrounding environment, the verbal or social, that determines the meaning of words, phrases, as well as the overall communication. So in our course, we talk about, or we study, or we learn two types of context. The first one is verbal context, and the second one is what we call as social context. So in terms of the definition, verbal context is when you refer to the words or the phrases and sentences surrounding a specific word or expression in speech or text, which will then determine the meaning, the tone, as well as the interpretation of that particular word that you were looking for. So that would be verbal context. And social context would be the immediate physical, social, or cultural setting in which people live, in which people interact and develop, shaping their behaviors, attitudes, as well as interpretations. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you try to understand context, you can do it in two ways: verbal context as well as social context. So that's under language variation. Let's talk now about language choice, the one in green. So what does it mean by language choice? Basically, language choice is the selection of a specific language or dialect or style of expression in communication, and this will be heavily influenced by social context, identity, and the participants involved. Basically, the people who use the language, they also give influence to the kind of language that they want to use. Now, under language choice, we will talk about bilingualism, and then we will also talk about code choice, code mix, as well as code switch. What does it mean by bilingualism? So bilingualism is the ability to know and, most importantly, to use at least two languages. And sometimes we also refer to this as multilingualism, where you know two or more languages. Now, there are two types of bilingualism: coordinate and compound. So let's first have a look at coordinate bilingualism. So basically, it is a form of language acquisition. Acquisition means you learn language. So it is a form of language acquisition where an individual learns two languages in separate contexts. So for example, home as well as school. Now have a look at this coordinate. So let's say a form of language acquisition where an individual learns two languages in separate contexts. So perhaps Bahasa Melayu at home and English at school. So this is coordinate bilingualism. And compound bilingualism is when a form of learning language or language acquisition where an individual learns two languages simultaneously in the same environment. That means learning Bahasa Melayu and English in the same environment. So basically, this happens if, let's say, the parents speak very well Bahasa Melayu and English, and then when they are raising the children, they actually use both languages equally. Both languages equally. So that's where you see compound bilingualism. So learning two languages in the same environment. Moving on to code choice. So we have here language choice, the selection of specific language. And here we have code choice. This is the strategic selection of a specific language, dialect or register based on social context, participant identity and communication intent. So basically language choice would be the umbrella to code choice. So code choice is basically a strategic selection, and normally we will have to look at the reason why we use that particular code to communicate. And then we look at code mix, the definition, the blending of multiple languages or linguistic varieties within a single conversation, sentence or utterance, often used by bilinguals to convey specific cultural, social or emotional nuances. Now just remember this, in one sentence there's more than one language. So for example, hey, let's makan. So that is a code mix, because in one sentence there's two languages. Code switch, on the other hand, is the practice of shifting between languages, dialects or accents or behaviors to fit different social contexts. So for code switch, you have to complete one sentence in one language and the second sentence will be another language, also full language for that second sentence. For example, hey, I'm hungry. That's one sentence. The second sentence, jom makan. So two sentences, one language and another language must be complete. So that's code switch. Okay, we have done language choice. Now the third one, language change. So what does it mean by language change, ladies and gentlemen? The continuous natural evolution of languages involving shift in vocabulary, sound and structure to adapt to new cultures and technologies. Now when you talk about language change, the same language, but for example the spelling system changes or the vocabulary changes, still same language. We are not talking about Bahasa Melayu to English, no. Language change, the changes that happen in one language. So there are types, 5 types of language change. We have lexical, that means words. phonetics, that means sound, spelling, of course, the way you spell something, semantics, meaning, and syntactic, sentence structure, and that would involve grammar. So 5 types of language change. Now, causes or factors of language change, we also have 5. Economy, because of economic reason you feel that you need to change certain spelling, for example. And then we have analogy, and then we have language context, and then we have medium of communication, and then we have cultural environment. Normally the most famous reason or factor of language change would be the economic reason or the economic factor. Now, under language change, we also look at pidgin. So what is pidgin? It is a grammatically simplified form of contact language that develops between 2 or more groups of people that do not share or have one common language. So normally this is done because of business as well as work. So work related and business related, we have 2 groups of people not talking the same language, and because of that a pidgin is born. So typically its vocabulary and grammar are limited. We're talking about characteristics now. For pidgin, the vocabulary and grammar are limited, and normally the words, they come from, of course, several languages, and pidgin does not have a native speaker. So no native speaker, basically no native speaker for pidgin. Now, after speakers of pidgin, they get together, they get to know each other, they get married, and then they have children. Now, the children of pidgin speakers will be talking Creole. So Creole is a pidgin language that has become the native language of the children of the adult pidgin speakers. So you look at the characteristic of pidgin, and the characteristics of Creole would be the opposite of the characteristics of pidgin. For example, there's a native speaker for Creole, and then of course the language is more extended in terms of the grammar, in terms of the vocabulary, in terms of the spelling and all. So that's under language change. Moving on, let's talk about language maintenance. Language maintenance. So what does it mean by language maintenance, ladies and gentlemen? It is the effort by a speech community to keep using their native language despite pressure from a dominant language. Basically, your effort to preserve your native language. And of course, if you talk about language maintenance, we are going to look at strategies to maintain as well as opportunities to maintain the native language. Strategies to maintain. We have 3 strategies. The first one would be attitudes of the speakers. Very important. If let's say you are a speaker of Bahasa Melayu, your native language is Bahasa Melayu, and your attitude towards Bahasa Melayu is like very low, perhaps you are not going to use Bahasa Melayu in your daily life. And because of that, it's going to be very hard to maintain Bahasa Melayu if everybody who uses Bahasa Melayu feels the same way. So at one point, language will shift. Okay, so attitudes of the speakers. And then another strategy is actually to attach that language as a symbol of identity. A symbol of identity is very, 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 very critical, very, very important. And when you talk about attaching it as a symbol of identity, for example, you have to use it in all official or in all formal events. So you use Bahasa Melayu properly, you talk to people in Bahasa Melayu, then it is a symbol of togetherness, a symbol, or a sense of identity amongst the speakers. The third one is actually how to maintain a language. Attitude, policies, knowledge of the speakers of the more dominant language. So we have to tackle this issue, we have to talk, we have to explain to the speakers of the more dominant language why that we have to maintain our own native language. This actually is not very obvious in Malaysia because Bahasa Melayu is already the official language. But if you go to the United States of America, for example, you will see that some speakers of these speech communities, they are trying very hard to actually maintain their language because of the pressure by the more dominant language, which is of course English language. Now, opportunities to maintain. So here we talk about first personal. This is an individual effort. Opportunities to maintain your personal effort to do it. And then social, the societal effort. Educational, societal effort. Intellectual, this is your own individual or personal effort. And then economic, and this is social effort. So basically, in order to maintain a language, there will be individual efforts as well as a societal effort. Moving on, let's look at language shift. So if, let's say, you fail to maintain your language, your native language, then language shift will happen. So what does it mean by language shift? The gradual process where a community or individual abandons their native language in favor of a more dominant, socially or economically prestigious language. So here you try to maintain your native language, language maintenance, and here language shift, you abandon your native language. So once again, let's have a look at the factors for language shift. We have 5 factors altogether, ladies and gentlemen. Factors or causes. We have demographic. Demographic means people staying in at one particular area. And then of course attitudes of the speakers. So these, if you look here, strategies, and these become the factors when speakers of the native language do not want to speak the language. And then for economic reason, you have to abandon your native language. Social, and last but not least, your political reason. So 5 factors or 5 causes why you abandon your native language. Now, what are the impacts? We have 2 negative impacts and then we have 1 positive impact. The first negative impact would be language loss for the affected communities. It's not language death, just loss. Not kematian, but kehilangan. Language loss for the affected communities. Sorry, slip of the tongue. So basically, if let's say a community or a person abandons the native language, then language loss for that particular community, the affected, what we call as affected communities. The second negative impact would be cultural disintegration. Now remember, language is part of culture. So if you actually lose a language, that means there will be cultural disintegration. So part of the culture will actually be missing, the language component of it. And looking at the positive impact, of course, you will be able to see, for example, the integration of the affected communities, the one that actually lost the language, native languages now. So this integration of these affected communities into the more dominant communities. Perhaps before the abandonment of the native language, that affected communities, they just stay together. They are not part of the main community which are more dominant. Basically, the dominant communities will be more dominant. So once that affected communities actually abandon their native language, then they become part of the more dominant communities. So that's the, I would say, positive, because they are no longer being isolated. They are now part of the bigger communities. They can actually easily adapt and assimilate because they speak the same language, and perhaps there will be more opportunities for them in terms of economy, in terms of being a political representative, so all those. So that's why here, if you talk or if you look at these factors and causes, you will see that economic reason, social or political reason. So that's the positive impact of these, factors or causes. Okay, let's have a look at the last one that we have learned. Now, if you notice, the way that I have explained this, they are not according to the weeks that we have learned the critical concepts or critical topics, but I arrange this so that you'll be able to understand the evolution, I would say, from what happened, and then what's the effect, and then what happened next. So that's why language death will be the last. What does it mean by language death? It occurs when a language loses its last native speaker, when there's no more native speakers, so ceasing to be used as a living means of communication. So language death, of course, is a sad situation. Perhaps in Malaysia we will not be able to witness any language death of our languages in Malaysia, but if you look across the world, we have Latin and Sanskrit being, the I would say victims of this language death. So remember, the definition of language death is when there's no more native speakers of that particular language. It's not like language shift. Let's say you as a person, you abandon your native language. Let's say you study abroad. Your native language is Bahasa Melayu. So let's say you are staying in Canada. So in Canada, there's no one who can speak Malay. So because of that, you abandon your native language. So you are actually experiencing language shift. It's not language death, because back in Malaysia, we have people who speak Bahasa Melayu. Only you who abandon Bahasa Melayu in Canada. So that's how you actually explain language shift and language death. Ladies and gentlemen, there are 5 types of language death. So we have gradual or slow, slow language death. Normally this is what happened to Latin and to Sanskrit. And then we have bottom to top language death. This is where the communities do not want to speak the language anymore, and then it becomes what we call as raffle effect to the top. And because of that, the government has to say something like, okay, we don't have to speak this language anymore, so we stop using this language. So that's bottom to top. And top to bottom would be the opposite. This is where the government says, okay, we have to stop using this language. So that is top to bottom. And then we have radical language death. So radical is like very in a situation where unthinkable kind of factor, radical language death. Let me think about this, and then I'll come back for an example of radical language death. And then we have languicide or sudden death. Now, sudden death, for example, in an island, speakers of, let's say, Jojo language. So in this island, not many speakers, only 400 native speakers of Jojo language. And then suddenly, this island disappears suddenly, maybe because of a volcanoes, maybe because of a earthquake, or tsunami. So people, all the native speakers died during this incident. So that is sudden death. Okay, that is sudden death. Languicide. And for radical language death, yeah, I remember, I think we talked about this as a process, for example, during war, radical language death. So that's the meaning of this. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. In terms of the critical concepts, we have covered all. We have we have talked about variation, choice, change, and then maintenance and shift and death. So last but not least would be this language evolution. So language evolution would be the step by step if you are talking about, language as a whole. What does it mean by language evolution? Refers to the cognitive, biological, and cultural development of human communication systems over time, transitioning from early simple forms to complex, diverse languages. So first thing first, the order. This must be in order. It cannot be like language depth first. It must be language trends first. So the evolution in order, language trends, which means popular aspects of the language, the styles, or new languages. And then we have language change. This is where from the language that the trend is now, and then you see maybe the spelling system changes in the same language. Remember, language change is in the same language. Changes in the spelling system, changes in the vocabulary, changes in the grammar and all those. So that is language change. Second, the third one would be language maintenance. So language maintenance, and then number 4 would be language shift, and last but not least, language death. So that's it, I guess. We have actually covered all critical concepts. And if, let's say, there are questions, for example, what is the link between language variation and language change? So if you look here, language variation, we talk about dialects and all. So you just take one example, for example, dialects, or you can take a standard language, and then you talk about types of language change. Maybe if you talk about lexical would be words. So if you talk about dialect, would be vocabulary, or if you talk about standard, would be the standard spelling system. If you talk about lexical and the language change. So those are the examples. So please, ladies and gentlemen, let me remind you how to answer the questions. First, please read the questions carefully. Understand what is required of you. Second, please look at the marks allocated for the questions. That will determine the length of your answer. Number 3, very important. In all questions, when you answer, you have to give definition, and then you have to give explanation, and then you have to give, of course, the examples. Now, definition, you have here the definition, and then let's say the question is the link, or what are the similarities. So the link and similarities or differences would be under explanation. Now have a look at the question, as I said, number 1 just now. What are the links? That means 2 links. What are the similarities? That means 2 similarities. If, let's say, the question say, what is the link? 1 link. Explain a similarity, 1 similarity. And this similarity, one more time, ladies and gentlemen, this similarity, this link, these differences must be explained under explanation, or must be written, must be argued, must be presented under explanation. And don't forget to write your examples as well. So I guess that's all, ladies and gentlemen, for our revision video. So hopefully, as I said, this can help you, can become one of the tools for your revision. And the best part is you can pause and you can read the notes attached to this. So inshallah, all will be well, and see you soon. Assalamualaikum and greetings to all once again.